They choose one member of the group to present their response to the class, and that will change, of course. And for example, on the first day, if Claudia presents her group's response, the next day or the next week, somebody else from that group would present the response. So a different person from the group will present the group's findings or the group's collaborative work. And this goes without saying, I imagine the last, though, as the students are working in their groups in this way, the teacher, of course, should walk around and be as helpful as he or she may be. Listen and, of course, learn the group names. It's important by at least the first or by the second week for sure to know the names of the group so you can address them as the Falcons or the Eagles or whatever they may be. Okay, what I'd like to do next, that's a little background for group work, and what I'd like to do now is to sort of talk about some basic syllable rules in the language, in English, and then to use those as sort of practical examples of group work, of this overall theme of collaborative learning. So what we'll do is we'll talk about some of these basic, there are four basic rules, and we'll put them in the context of group work. The first is, they're all related to syllables. The first is related to past tense ed and how to add a syllable there. The second is syllables adding es and adding a syllable there. The third is syllables and counting syllables to know where you place stress on words. And the last is two-syllable nouns and verbs where the stress falls on those. So those are the four things we'll talk about regarding syllables. Okay, number one. Just as the quick rule, I apologize, many of you may already know this, but I want to use these again as an example of group work. So the first rule here, syllables past tense with the ed. Most of the time, when ed is added to a verb to make it past tense, the number of syllables does not change when you are speaking. However, if the last sound of a regular verb is t or d, the past tense has an extra syllable. You need to add a syllable. For example, the words heat, hate, add, and trade. The first two have end in a sound of T, the last two end with a D sound. So when you put them in the past tense, heated, hated, added, traded, you add a syllable. Okay, so in their groups, for example, on the first day, depending of course on where the students, what they'd studied the previous semester or so, but we'll say that this is what we're working on our first day after we've recapped some things from last semester maybe. What you can do is after this rule, with this ED rule, if they're in their groups, you can give them, what I suggest in the beginning is to give them some latitude, and in some cases we'll give some specific guidelines, but on the first day, initially here, I think it's a good idea to give them some space to invent, some space to play and talk to each other. So what I suggest here is in their groups, they can choose a theme or a topic, almost anything that they would like. If they're struggling, of course, you can give them a more specific topic yourself. And then they are to do more or less the same thing, to write a brief paragraph using 4 or 5 of the following verbs. And what I've done is I've listed a few verbs here that end in T, that end in D, and then others that do not. And so these you would add a syllable, and many of these you do not add a syllable when adding the EDs. And so the idea is for each group to write a little paragraph, a little story, and again, the concept is for them to work together, to get to know each other, and to come up collaboratively with one paragraph, just using 4 or 5 of any of these words. And in that way we practice the rule, the syllable rule of ED while encouraging this group activity. And then again, the same thing, each group chooses one member to read their paragraph aloud. And it, of course, should be a different member every time. Okay, the second rule, our second syllable rule, is adding ES. When adding ES to a noun, for example, watches, or to conjugate a verb, he watches, add a syllable if the base word or the root word ends in these 6 sounds or these 6 letters. GE like change, S like miss, CH like catch, SH like dish, X like wax, Z or ZE like quiz or gaze. And so, for example, changes, Because change ends in GE, when we add ES, you have to add a syllable when speaking, right? Misses, catches, dishes, etc. And so with this rule, once we've gone over, these are just examples, of course, of what we can do in the class. Clearly, we wouldn't have time to do all 4 of these in the same initial class. These are just ideas. If we were to use that rule, again, in their groups, a similar thing. Ask students to invent a theme for a paragraph and use some of the words listed above for this rule, changes, misses. Also, in conjunction with this particular exercise, or many of the others as well, ask them, again, along the ideas of invention, asking them to invent together, to think of other words that they know that end in these similar, that have these similar endings. And you, both the teacher and the students, I think, will be surprised at how much the students actually do know, how much vocabulary they already have. This is another point I want to make about groups, it encourages, it brings to light how much students already know, which goes along with the confidence idea, and it encourages them to see, I knew that, and to contribute, or so-and-so knew this. So that's one thing I would say is, in the sense of leaving it open, giving them some latitude, is to ask them to think of, regarding any rule, to think of other words or contexts or phrases that they already know that would apply to that rule. Okay, the third, regarding syllables, counting syllables to place stress. I offered just 2 examples here, basically. And like these other rules, I do want to stress now that the rules are a base. They're some place to start from. And then the idea is to work with these rules in regular conversation, in group work, of course, and things like that. So I do want to stress that the rules are basically just a base for us to work with fluidly later. As I say up here, with practice, the rhythm of the language will guide them once they have the rules. Okay, continuing with counting syllables. There are 2 examples of this that I say. The first one is if a word ends in ATE or ITY, you start with the last syllable and count backwards 2 syllables to see where the stress falls, where the stress on the word falls. So for example, conglomerate. Conglomerate has 4 syllables. You start at the last and you count back 2, and that's where the stress would fall. Or negotiate. Negotiate, 4 syllables, same thing. Start at the end, count back 2. 1, 2, and there's the stress. Regulate has only 3. Regulate, but it's the same rule. You start at the end and count back 2. Start at the end, 1, 2, and that's where the stress falls. So again, if a word ends in ATE or ITY, start with the last syllable and count backwards. 2 syllables, and that's where the stress is. ITY, these are some examples of ITY. Ability, ability are 4. Start at the end and count back 2. 1, 2, and that's where the stress is. Or hospitality, hospitality has 5, but the rule is the same. Start at the end and count back 2. 1, 2, and that's where the stress is. And so, again, these are just rules for a base, and then once as students start recognizing other words that end in ATE and ITY, the rhythm of the language should take us from there. Okay, if a word ends also in IC or ICS, these are just other examples, ION, IONS. If a word ends in these, you start with the last syllable and count backwards 1 syllable to see where the stress falls. The other one you count back 2, here we count back 1. So for example, economic. Economic are 4, start at the end, count back 1, and that's the stress. Or the plural is the same. Economics, there are 4, start at the end and count back 1. Same thing with ION. Institution. Institution has 4, start at the end, count back 1. Or vacation. Vacation has 3, start at the end and count back 1. Okay, and so in their groups, again, this is basically one thing you could do on the first day or even in the first week. I continue to push the same formula because I think this is the biggest message I want to give. Using examples of any of these rules or others, of course, that you would like to use, the idea is to get the students to invent together.